He thought planting evidence would end her career, but it was the moment his own life began to collapse. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest and made every breath feel heavier than the last. And standing there in the center of it all was Officer Daniel Hayes, shoulders stiff, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward as if refusing to accept the reality unfolding around him, while just a few feet away, elevated above him in quiet authority, sat federal judge Alicia Carter, her expression calm, unreadable, almost distant, yet carrying a weight that filled the entire room without a single raised word. And if you had walked in at that exact moment, you would have seen the ending before ever understanding the beginning. A decorated officer facing 25 years in federal prison and a civil judgment of $28 million, all tied to a single decision made just hours earlier. And the question hanging in the air wasn't just what happened, but how someone trusted with enforcing the law could fall so completely under its judgment. And as the gavel echoed once, sharp and final, the story began to rewind, not in noise, but in memory, back to a cold Chicago morning where the air cut through wool coats and the sidewalks outside the federal courthouse were already alive with hurried footsteps and quiet tension, the kind of place where power moved silently and decisions changed lives without warning. And among the crowd was a woman who didn't stand out at first glance, Alicia Carter, dressed simply, walking with purpose but without display, her presence steady, grounded, as if she belonged there in a way no one needed to announce. And across the street, leaning slightly against his patrol car, Daniel Hayes scanned the scene with practiced eyes, a man shaped by routine, by pressure, by a system that rewarded results more than reflection. And on that morning, something in him had already shifted, a quiet frustration, a need to prove control, to assert authority in a world that no longer felt predictable. And when his gaze landed on Alicia, he didn't see a federal judge. He saw an opportunity, or at least what he convinced himself was one, and everything that followed came not from confusion, but from choice, deliberate, calculated, a moment where the line between right and wrong didn't blur, it was simply ignored. And as the city moved around them, unaware, the first step toward that silent courtroom and that final sentence had already been taken, not with force, not with chaos, but with a single decision made in complete confidence that no one would ever question it. And that was the moment everything began to unravel. Daniel Hayes pushed himself off the patrol car and stepped into the flow of people moving toward the courthouse, his boots striking the concrete with a rhythm that matched the tension building inside him. And from a distance, Alicia Carter continued forward without hesitation, her pace steady, her posture composed, as if she had already calculated every step of the day ahead. And for a brief moment their paths aligned in the same frame of movement, two individuals walking toward the same building for entirely different reasons, one grounded in purpose, the other drifting toward a decision he had not yet fully admitted to himself. And when Daniel called out, his voice carried the sharp authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Ma'am, I need you to stop for a moment." It cut through the morning noise just enough to make nearby heads turn, and Alicia paused, not abruptly, not defensively, but with a controlled stillness that suggested she was listening rather than reacting. And when she turned to face him, her expression remained calm, her eyes steady, offering nothing that could be interpreted as fear or resistance, which for Daniel was not reassurance but irritation, because in his world hesitation and nervousness were signs he understood, signs he could control, but this quiet composure unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. And as he approached, closing the distance with measured steps, he began speaking in a tone that sounded procedural but carried an undercurrent of assumption, explaining that there had been reports, that he needed to ask a few questions, that it would only take a minute. And while his words followed the structure of protocol, his mind had already moved beyond it, already building a narrative that justified what he was about to do. And Alicia listened without interruption, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze never leaving his. And when she finally spoke, her voice was even, controlled, almost gentle. "Officer, I am on my way to a scheduled proceeding," she said, not as a challenge, not as a defense, but as a simple statement of fact. And for a fraction of a second, there was an opening, a moment where Daniel could have stepped back, could have let the interaction end as nothing more than a brief exchange on a busy morning. But instead, he leaned further into his decision, because something in him needed to assert that he was right, that he was in control, that the badge on his chest meant he did not have to second-guess himself. And the crowd around them began to slow, subtle at first, then more noticeable, people sensing that something was happening even if they did not yet understand what. And Daniel's tone sharpened just enough to signal a shift, asking her to remain where she was, asking to check her belongings, framing it as routine while internally crossing a line he had already justified. And Alicia did not step back, did not raise her voice, did not resist. Instead, she simply held his gaze and said quietly, "You should think carefully about what you are doing." And there was no threat in her words, no urgency, just a calm certainty that lingered in the air longer than expected. But Daniel heard it as defiance, or perhaps he needed to, because acknowledging anything else would have forced him to stop, and stopping was no longer an option he was willing to consider. And as he reached the point where action replaced intention, the distance between right and wrong closed completely, not with chaos, not with noise, but with a single irreversible step taken in full view of a city that had not yet realized it was witnessing the beginning of a reckoning. The moment passed, but Daniel did not step back, and once a decision like that settles in, it does not fade quietly. It hardens, it demands action, and with a controlled motion that appeared routine to anyone watching from a distance, he reached toward her bag, maintaining the tone of procedure while internally committing to something far more deliberate. And Alicia did not move to stop him. She did not raise her voice. She did not even shift her stance. Instead, she simply watched him, her expression unchanged, her silence stretching longer than comfort allowed. And that silence began to ripple outward, because people nearby were no longer just passing by. They were slowing, observing, sensing that this was no longer a routine check, but something heavier, something that carried weight even if they could not yet define it. And Daniel, aware of the growing attention, leaned further into authority, speaking louder now, reinforcing the idea that everything happening was justified, that he was following protocol, that there was nothing unusual about the way he handled the situation. And yet beneath that surface, his actions were no longer guided by training but by assumption, by a narrative he had already decided was true. And when he opened her bag, there was a brief pause, a fraction of a second where time seemed to hold its breath. And in that space, there was still a choice, still a moment where he could have stopped, closed the bag, allowed the situation to dissolve into nothing more than a misunderstanding. But instead he moved forward, completing the act he had set in motion. And when he stepped back, holding the item he had introduced into the situation, his voice carried a new edge, one that shifted the atmosphere instantly. Accusations now replacing questions, certainty replacing inquiry, and the crowd reacted the way crowds often do, with quiet murmurs, with exchanged glances, with a subtle shift from curiosity to judgment. And Alicia stood there in the center of it, not reacting to the words, not responding to the implication, but absorbing the moment with a composure that did not match the situation. And that contrast, more than anything else, unsettled the space around them. Because people expect fear in moments like that. They expect protest, they expect emotion, but what they saw instead was stillness, and that stillness carried its own kind of power, one that did not shout but lingered. And Daniel mistook it again, interpreting it as compliance, as resignation, as confirmation that he was in control. And he moved to formalize the situation, his voice steady as he explained what would happen next, how she would need to come with him, how the process would continue. And Alicia finally spoke again, her voice just as calm as before. "You are making a mistake that cannot be undone." And there was no anger in it, no fear, just a quiet certainty that seemed out of place in the middle of escalating tension. And for a brief second, something flickered across Daniel's expression, not doubt exactly, but awareness, a recognition that something about this was not aligning the way it should. And yet he pushed past it, because acknowledging it would mean unraveling everything he had just done, and that was not something he was prepared to face. And as he guided her toward the courthouse entrance, the building itself loomed larger, its steps rising like a threshold between two versions of reality, one where he still believed he was in control, and Another that had already begun to take shape beyond his understanding. And inside, behind those heavy doors, systems were already in motion. Cameras had recorded more than he realized. Eyes had seen more than he accounted for. And the quiet machinery of accountability had begun to turn, not loudly, not immediately, but steadily. And as Alicia walked beside him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, it became clear that while Daniel believed he was leading her into the system, the truth was far more unsettling, because step by step, he was walking himself directly into it. The courthouse doors closed behind them with a muted weight that seemed heavier than sound itself, and the moment Daniel stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but in subtle layers that most people would not notice unless they were looking for it. And yet Alicia noticed, not because something had changed, but because she understood the system they had just entered in a way Daniel did not. And as they moved through the security checkpoint, the rhythm of the building unfolded around them, metal detectors chiming softly, officers exchanging routine nods, clerks moving quickly with folders pressed against their chests, all of it functioning like a machine built on order and procedure. And Daniel carried himself with renewed confidence, as if stepping into this space reinforced his authority, as if the walls themselves supported his version of events. And he began speaking again, outlining next steps, referencing protocol, using language that sounded official enough to remove doubt from anyone listening. And Alicia walked beside him without resistance, her gaze forward, her posture composed, her silence continuing to stretch in a way that now began to draw more than curiosity, because inside this building, silence did not always mean submission. Sometimes it meant awareness, sometimes it meant timing. And as they approached the inner hallway leading toward the courtrooms, a few individuals slowed as they recognized the direction they were heading, not reacting outwardly, not interrupting, but observing with a quiet attention that Daniel failed to register. And one clerk, standing near a doorway, glanced at Alicia for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly before she looked away. And that moment passed without comment, but it did not disappear. It lingered, adding to a pattern that was forming just outside Daniel's awareness. And as he continued forward, his tone steady, his pace controlled, he gestured toward a holding area, explaining that they would process everything inside, that it would be straightforward, that there was nothing complicated about the situation. And Alicia finally turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him, and said quietly, "Nothing about this is simple." And her voice carried no tension, no urgency, just a level certainty that contrasted sharply with the environment around them. And for a brief second, Daniel hesitated, not stopping, but slowing just enough for the moment to register, because something in her words did not fit the narrative he had constructed. And yet once again, he moved past it, because turning back would require him to question himself. And questioning himself was not something he had learned to do in moments like this. And as they reached the doors leading into the courtroom corridor, the space opened slightly, ceilings higher, voices lower, the weight of authority more present in the air, and a bailiff standing near the entrance glanced up, his eyes moving from Daniel to Alicia and back again. And there was a pause, brief but noticeable, before he stepped aside without comment. And Daniel interpreted it as compliance, as confirmation that everything was proceeding as expected. But what he did not understand was that recognition does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it observes, sometimes it allows events to continue just long enough to reveal the full truth. And as Alicia stepped forward into the corridor, her pace unchanged, her expression steady, it became clear that while Daniel believed he was guiding the situation toward resolution, the environment itself had already begun to shift around him, aligning not with his assumptions, but with a reality he had yet to face. And somewhere within the building, beyond the visible movement of people and paperwork, processes were quietly activating, records were being accessed, timelines were beginning to form, and the moment he thought he controlled was no longer his. Because in a system built on truth, even the smallest deviation does not disappear, it waits, it gathers, and then, without warning, it surfaces all at once. They entered the courtroom corridor, and the air changed again, quieter now, more deliberate, as if every sound had to earn its place. and Daniel felt it without fully understanding it. The way voices dropped lower, the way footsteps slowed, the way even movement seemed measured against an invisible standard, and still he moved forward with the same certainty he had carried from the street. Because in his mind the outcome had already been decided. The report would be filed, the evidence would stand, the system would support him as it always had. And Alicia walked beside him, her composure untouched, her silence no longer just noticeable but defining, shaping the space around her in a way that did not demand attention yet could not be ignored. And as they approached the courtroom doors, a small group of attorneys standing nearby paused their conversation, not abruptly, not dramatically, but just enough for the shift to be felt, their eyes moving briefly toward Alicia, then toward Daniel, then back again, and one of them adjusted his posture slightly, as if reconsidering something he had not yet voiced, and Daniel noticed none of it, because his focus remained fixed on process, on completion, on the steps he believed would carry him through without consequence. And when he reached for the door, the bailiff inside glanced up, his expression neutral at first, then tightening almost imperceptibly as recognition flickered across his face. Not loud enough to stop the moment, not strong enough to interrupt it, but present, undeniable, and he stepped aside without a word, allowing them to enter, and the courtroom itself opened before them. Rows of wooden benches, the elevated bench at the front, the seal mounted high on the wall, everything arranged with precision and authority, and yet the room was not full, not yet. Only a few early arrivals, a clerk organizing documents, a court reporter adjusting her equipment, and as Alicia stepped forward into that space, something shifted again, subtle but unmistakable, because this was not unfamiliar ground to her. This was not a place she entered with uncertainty, and even without saying it, her presence carried a quiet ownership that did not align with the situation Daniel believed he controlled, and he began speaking again, outlining what would happen next, his voice steady, formal, reinforcing the structure he trusted, and Alicia listened, her gaze moving briefly across the room, taking in details that Daniel did not register, the position of the clerk, the readiness of the recording equipment, the alignment of everything. That suggested this was not a place where truth could be easily reshaped once it had been documented. And then she said, softly, almost as if to herself, "You still have time to stop." And the words hung there, not directed with force, not spoken with urgency, just placed into the moment like a final option, and Daniel paused, just for a second, his hands still near the edge of the table, his mind catching on something he could not fully articulate, because now the pattern was harder to ignore. The glances, the silence, the way the room seemed to recognize something he did not, and yet instead of stepping back, he moved forward again, because retreat would mean acknowledging that something was wrong. And acknowledging that would mean facing the possibility that everything he had done was already unraveling. And as he began to set the process in motion, the courtroom doors opened behind them, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality, and footsteps entered the room. Measured, confident, and in that instant, before a single word was spoken, before any title was announced, the atmosphere shifted one last time, not in uncertainty, but in clarity, as if the room itself had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal what Daniel had failed to see from the very beginning. The footsteps that entered the courtroom carried a rhythm that did not rush, did not hesitate, and did not ask for attention. Yet every person in the room felt them before they fully registered who had arrived. And as the door closed softly behind them, the shift became undeniable, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute, like a line quietly drawn between what had been assumed and what was about to be revealed. And Daniel turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him, expecting routine, expecting reinforcement, expecting the system to continue aligning with his version of events. But what he saw did not match expectation, because the individuals who entered were not reacting with confusion or urgency. They were composed, observant, and more importantly, they were looking at Alicia, not as a suspect, not as someone out of place, but with recognition, with a level of awareness that immediately began to unravel the narrative Daniel had constructed. And Alicia did not move toward them, did not signal, did not announce anything. She simply stood where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. And that was when the silence in the room deepened, not empty, but full, heavy with understanding that had not yet been spoken aloud. And one of the officials stepped forward slightly, his voice calm, measured, carrying authority without needing to raise it. And though he did not address Daniel directly at first, his presence alone shifted the balance of the room, and Daniel felt it, not as a clear realization, but as a growing discomfort, a sense that the structure he relied on was no longer holding the way it should. And when the clerk near the bench straightened, her hands pausing over the documents she had been organizing, and the court reporter adjusted her position with a quiet precision that suggested readiness rather than routine, the pattern became harder to ignore, because this was not how a standard process unfolded. This was something else, something larger, something already in motion. Before Daniel had even stepped through the doors, and then, without announcement, without spectacle, Alicia took a step forward, not toward Daniel, not toward the exit, but toward the front of the courtroom, and that single movement carried more weight than any spoken declaration, because it was not reactive, it was intentional, it was familiar, and as she moved, the room responded in subtle ways, a shift in posture, a change in focus, an alignment that did not need instruction, and Daniel remained where he was, his certainty now fractured into questions he had not prepared to answer. And when Alicia reached the front, she turned, not to face him directly, but to face the room, her gaze steady, her presence fully realized in a way that no longer allowed misinterpretation. And in that moment, the truth did not explode, it settled. It became visible in the quiet recognition shared by everyone except the one person who needed to understand it most. And Daniel's mind moved quickly, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed, searching for an explanation that would restore control, but none came, because the situation had moved beyond explanation, beyond assumption, into something far more definitive. And as the official who had entered earlier finally spoke, addressing Alicia with a tone of respect that could not be mistaken, the last illusion Daniel held on to began to fall away, not violently, not suddenly, but with a clarity that left no space for denial. And in that stillness, where no one raised their voice and no dramatic gesture was needed, the roles in the room reversed completely, because the person he believed he had brought in as a suspect had never been out of place, and the authority he believed he carried had never truly been his to control. And now, standing in the center of a system he thought he understood, Daniel was no longer guiding the moment, he was inside it, subject to it, and the realization, quiet but absolute, had only just begun. The room did not erupt, it did not gasp, it did not react the way people expect when truth is revealed. Instead it settled into a deeper silence, one that carried weight and clarity, and in that silence every small movement became louder than words. The way the clerk straightened her posture, the way the bailiff shifted his stance, the way the officials who had entered positioned themselves not around Daniel, but around the structure of the courtroom itself, aligning with something that had already been established long before he arrived. And Alicia stood at the front with a calm authority that no longer needed to be questioned or interpreted, because now it was visible, undeniable, and when she finally spoke, her voice was not raised, not sharpened, but steady, measured, carrying the kind of control that comes not from force but from certainty. "Officer Hayes," she said, and hearing his name spoken in that tone, in that space, shifted something inside him more than any accusation could have, because it was no longer about what he had done, it was about where he had done it, and who he had done it to. And for the first time since the morning began, Daniel did not respond immediately, not because he chose not to, but because the words he had relied on all day no longer fit the situation in front of him. And Alicia continued, not rushing, not pressing, simply stating what was already evident to everyone else in the room, that the events leading to this moment had been observed, that procedures had been documented, that systems designed to ensure accountability were already in motion. And as she spoke, the officials near the entrance moved with quiet coordination, not surrounding him, not creating a scene, but establishing a presence that made it clear the direction of control had shifted completely. And Daniel's mind searched for ground, for something to hold on to, protocol, authority, anything that could restore the structure he had relied on. But each option slipped away as quickly as it formed, because none of them accounted for the reality now standing in front of him. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried less certainty than before, the confidence replaced by something closer to strain, as if he were trying to hold together a version of events that no longer aligned with the room. And Alicia did not interrupt him, did not challenge him directly. She simply listened, allowing his words to exist in a space where they could no longer shape the outcome. And when he finished, the silence returned, heavier now, more defined, and she responded with the same calm precision, not attacking, not accusing, but clarifying, drawing a line between assumption and fact, between authority and responsibility. And in that distinction, the entire structure of the situation became clear, because what had been presented as control was now visible as overreach. What had been framed as procedure was now revealed as deviation, and the system Daniel believed would support him was now the very system evaluating him. And as that realization settled, it did not come with noise or spectacle. It came with stillness, with the quiet understanding that nothing he said in that moment could reverse what had already been set in motion, and the official stepped forward, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with a finality that did not need explanation. And for the first time, Daniel did not lead, did not direct, did not control. He followed, not because he chose to, but because the structure of the room no longer responded to him. And as he moved, guided by a system he once believed he represented, the weight of the moment became unavoidable, because this was not a misunderstanding, not a confusion of roles. It was a complete reversal, and standing there, under the same lights, within the same walls he trusted, Daniel Hayes was no longer the one enforcing the law. He was the one being held accountable by it. What followed did not unfold with chaos or raised voices. It moved with precision, with the kind of quiet efficiency that only exists inside a system designed to correct itself. And as Daniel stood there, no longer at the center of control, but at the center of scrutiny, the process began to take shape around him in ways he could not interrupt or redirect. And the officials who had stepped forward earlier now spoke in measured tones, outlining next steps not as suggestions, but as established procedure. And for the first time that morning, Daniel listened instead of instructed, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly as the weight of the situation settled deeper into his awareness. And Alicia remained at the front, her presence unchanged, not imposing, not aggressive, but undeniably authoritative. And when she spoke again, it was not to confront him directly, it was to acknowledge the system itself, to affirm that what had occurred would be reviewed in full, that every detail would be examined, and that accountability would not be based on perception but on documented fact. And as those words moved through the room, they carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation, because this was no longer about a single moment outside the courthouse. It was about a sequence of decisions that had been recorded, observed, and preserved in ways Daniel had not accounted for. And one of the officials referenced the surveillance coverage from the exterior entrance, the interior hallway, the security checkpoint, each location forming a continuous record that could not be altered or reframed. And as those details were mentioned, the narrative Daniel had relied on began to dissolve completely, because there was no gap, no missing piece, no uncertainty that could be shaped into justification. And Alicia turned her attention briefly toward him, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a steady recognition of what had unfolded. And she said, quietly, "This is why the system exists." And the words were not directed as a lesson, but as a statement of reality. And in that moment, the full structure of consequence became visible, not as punishment, but as outcome, the natural result of actions placed within a system that ultimately answers to truth. And Daniel's mind moved through the possibilities, searching for a way to explain, to reframe, to regain footing, but each attempt met the same barrier, because the evidence was no longer abstract. It was specific, it was continuous, it was undeniable, and the officials proceeded without urgency, but without delay, documenting statements, confirming timelines, aligning procedures with the events that had taken place. And the courtroom, which had once felt like a space Daniel controlled, now functioned as something entirely different, a place where every action carried weight beyond intention, where every decision was measured against standards that did not bend to assumption. And as the process advanced, the roles within the room became fully defined, Alicia as the authority grounded in law, the officials as the mechanism of accountability, and Daniel as the subject within that mechanism, no longer interpreting the system, but being interpreted by it. And when the final steps of that initial process were outlined, there was no dramatic declaration, no sudden shift, just a clear path forward that extended beyond the room, into investigations, into hearings, into outcomes that would unfold with the same precision now guiding every moment. And as Daniel was directed to move, not with force, but with quiet instruction, he understood something that had not been clear before. That control is not determined by who speaks the loudest or acts the fastest. It is determined by who stands aligned with the truth when everything is seen. And in that realization, the last remnants of certainty he carried from the street outside the courthouse disappeared, replaced by a silence that no longer belonged to the room, but to him. Because for the first time, there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to control, only the process he had set in motion, now moving forward without him at the center of it. By the time the process moved beyond that courtroom, the outcome was no longer a question of possibility. It was a matter of time, and time, unlike assumption, does not bend. It reveals, it unfolds, it brings every hidden decision into full view. And in the weeks that followed, what began as a single moment outside a courthouse expanded into a complete examination of actions, timelines, and intent, each detail placed under the same quiet scrutiny that had first taken hold in that room. And Daniel Hayes, who once stood with certainty rooted in authority, now found himself measured against a system that no longer responded to confidence but to evidence. And the record was clear, not because someone declared it, but because it had been preserved step by step, from the first interaction on the sidewalk to the final moments inside the courtroom. Every movement aligned into a sequence that could not be reinterpreted or dismissed, and as the legal process advanced, the consequences formed with the same precision that had guided the investigation, not exaggerated, not emotional, but exact, defined by statutes, by standards, by a structure designed to ensure that no action exists without accountability. And when the final judgment was delivered, it carried no raised voices, no spectacle, just a clarity that settled into the room. The same way truth had from the beginning, 25 years of federal sentencing and a civil judgment that reflected the scale of what had been done, not as retaliation, but as recognition of impact. And Alicia Carter remained composed through it all, not seeking validation, not expressing triumph. Because for her, this was never about personal victory. It was about the system functioning as it was meant to, about ensuring that the same structure used to question others would also hold those within it to the same standard. And as she looked across the room one final time, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, it became clear that power does not come from the ability to act without consequence. It comes from the discipline to act within truth even when no one is watching. And Daniel, standing where he once believed he could not be challenged, now understood something that had been invisible to him before. That authority without integrity is not control, it is exposure. Waiting for the right moment. And that moment does not arrive with noise or warning. It arrives quietly, precisely. And when it does not ask who you were, it shows who you chose to be. And as the courtroom emptied, as footsteps faded and the doors closed once again, the echo left behind was not of punishment, but of balance restored, because in the end, the law had not been overturned. It had simply revealed its true face, and it was never the one Daniel thought he could control.